I sit on the porch of this old, decrepit house, my hands trembling as I hold a cup of tea. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and the memories of that dreadful night come flooding back. It's a story I've never told, a story that still haunts my every waking moment. I was 10 years old, and my sister, Emily, was 16. She had always been different, but in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, she became someone I didn't recognize. She talked to herself, stared at the walls for hours, and laughed at nothing. My parents thought it was just a phase, typical teenage angst, but I knew something was wrong. It all started with the whispers. Emily would sit in her room, whispering to someone who wasn't there. I would hear her through the thin walls of our old house, her voice soft and eerie. One night I mustered up the courage to ask her who she was talking to. "They're my friends," she said, her eyes wide and wild. "They tell me things, secrets about our family." I didn't understand, but I was scared. I told my parents, but they brushed it off. They didn't see what I saw, the darkness creeping into her eyes, the way her smile twisted into something sinister. The first to die was our dog, Max. I found him in the backyard, his throat slit, his lifeless eyes staring up at me. I ran inside, screaming for my parents. They came out, horrified, but Emily just stood there, watching us with a strange smile on her face. "It wasn't me," she said, but I knew better. The whispers had told her to do it. A week later, my father was the next to go. I woke up to the sound of screaming and ran to his room. He was lying in bed, his chest covered in blood, a knife sticking out of his heart. Emily stood over him, the knife in her hand, her eyes glowing with a madness I had never seen before. "Emily, what have you done?" my mother cried, but Emily just laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed through the house. "I'm freeing us," she said. "He was a liar, a monster. The whispers told me." My mother tried to take the knife from her, but Emily was too quick. She turned on her, stabbing her over and over again until she collapsed to the floor, her blood pooling around her. I stood there, frozen in fear, unable to move or speak. "Come here, little brother," Emily said, her voice soft and coaxing. "I won't hurt you." I backed away, but she grabbed my arm, pulling me close. Her breath was hot against my ear as she whispered, "They're next. The neighbors. We'll be free, all of us." I managed to break free and ran out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the neighborhood, where I found Mr. Jenkins, our elderly neighbor. He took me in, called the police, but it was too late. By the time they arrived, Emily had killed everyone. I watched from Mr. Jenkins' window as they carried out the bodies, my sister among them. She was lying in the middle of the living room, a piece of rubble impaling her chest, her eyes wide open in death. And then I saw him, the demon. He was tall, with eyes as black as coal, and a smile that sent shivers down my spine. He walked over to Emily's body, crouched down beside her, and said, "I had a blast, Emily. Unfortunately, the only thing I need from you is your soul." He stood up, his eyes meeting mine through the window. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and then he was gone. The neighbors who survived the massacre saw him too, but no one spoke of it. Years have passed since that night, but the memories are as vivid as ever. I am the old man now, the sole survivor of a tragedy that claimed my family and my sanity. I sit here, on this porch, watching the sun set, and I wonder how much longer I can bear the weight of this story. Emily's voice still haunts me, her laughter echoing in my mind. The demon's words are a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks within us all, and as the shadows grow longer, I can't help but feel that he is still out there, watching, waiting. I take a deep breath and close my eyes, the images of that night playing out behind my eyelids. I see Emily, her eyes wide and wild, the knife in her hand. I see the demon, his cold, cruel smile. and I hear the whispers growing louder and louder until they are all I can hear. The end is near, I can feel it. The past is catching up with me, and soon I will be reunited with my family. But until then, I will sit here on this porch and wait for the darkness to claim me once more.
I remember the night I ran away from home as if it were yesterday, though it feels like a lifetime ago. The streets were empty, the air thick with the anticipation of rain. My sneakers slapped against the wet pavement as I made my way to the train station. My backpack heavy with the few belongings I'd grabbed in haste, I was determined to leave it all behind. The fighting, the loneliness, the suffocating sense of being trapped in a life that wasn't mine. I reached the station, my chest heaving with the effort of running and the weight of my decision. Tears blurred my vision, and I wiped them away with the back of my hand, smudging the mascara I had applied earlier that day. As I sat on a cold metal bench trying to catch my breath, I noticed a figure standing a few feet away, partially hidden in the shadows. He stepped forward, and I could see him more clearly. A man in his late 20s, dressed in a dark coat and a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. His eyes were kind, but there was something unsettling about the way they seemed to see right through me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft and soothing. I shook my head, unable to find the words to express the turmoil inside me. He gestured to the empty space beside me, and I nodded, allowing him to sit down. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice barely a whisper. He tilted his head, studying me with a curious expression. "You don't look fine," he said gently. "Sometimes it helps to talk to a stranger. No judgments, just listening." I hesitated, then began to tell him everything. About my parents, who were too busy with their own lives to notice me. About my friends, who seemed more interested in their social media followers than in genuine connections. About the overwhelming sense of isolation that had driven me to this moment. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, he sighed and looked thoughtful. "I understand why you want to leave," he said. "But give me one chance to persuade you that you're making a terrible mistake." I looked at him, confused. "How would you do that?" He smiled, a mysterious glint in his eyes. "Tell me about your favorite places." For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of warmth. I thought of the places that had brought me comfort, the places I went when I needed to escape. I began to list them off. My favorite cafe with the best hot chocolate, the bookstore with the cozy reading nook, the park with the swing set that cracked when you went too high. He stood up and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said, his smile widening. "Let's visit them all." I hesitated, then took his hand. We left the station and ran through the quiet streets, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the buildings. The rain had started to fall, but it didn't matter. We laughed as we dashed through puddles, our clothes getting soaked. We started at the cafe, where he ordered hot chocolate for both of us. We sat by the window, watching the rain pour down, the warm, sweet drink filling us with a sense of comfort. He asked me about the books I loved, and we talked for hours about stories and characters, losing ourselves in the world of words. Next, we went to the bookstore. The familiar scent of old pages and leather-bound volumes greeted us as we entered. I showed him my favorite section, where I spent hours curled up in the corner, lost in another world. He picked out a book and read a passage aloud, his voice deep and mesmerizing. After that, we headed to the park. The swings were slick with rain, but we didn't care. We took turns pushing each other, our laughter mixing with the creaking of the swings. For the first time in ages, I felt free, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. As the night wore on, we visited more of my favorite spots. A little bakery with the best pastries, A hidden garden filled with blooming flowers, a mural-covered alleyway where I'd once spent an entire afternoon sketching. We talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories. For a moment, I forgot why I had run away. I forgot about the pain and the loneliness. I was just a girl, spending a magical night with a stranger who felt like an old friend. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. We walked down the quiet streets, the world still asleep. I felt a strange sense of peace, a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. We stopped in front of a house and I realized with a start that it was mine. I looked at the man in surprise. "How did we end up here?" I asked, confusion lacing my words. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's because you were never supposed to leave," he said softly. "You've always meant to stay here." Before I could respond, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something. He placed it in my hand, closing my fingers around it. I felt a cold, sticky sensation, and when I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. It was a bloodied knife. I stared at the knife in horror, my mind racing. The memories came flooding back, the things we had done, the places we had been. But they weren't the beautiful, innocent moments I had thought. No, they were twisted and dark, acts of vandalism and violence. The cafe, the bookstore, the park, they were all covered in graffiti and broken glass. The bakery had been ransacked, the garden trampled, the mural defaced. The entire night had been a blur of destruction, and I had been the one wielding the knife. I looked up at the man, my heart pounding in my chest. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You're never supposed to leave," he repeated, his voice low and menacing. "I'm the reason you stay." I stumbled back, dropping the knife as if it burned me. Tears streamed down my face, my chest heaving with sobs. I fell to my knees, hyperventilating, unable to comprehend what had happened. The sound of police sirens filled the air, blue and red lights flashing in the distance. They were getting closer, coming for me. The man stood there, watching me with detached amusement. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. "You're trapped," he whispered, "just like me." He straightened up and walked away, disappearing into the dawn. The sirens grew louder, the lights brighter. I sat there, my mind shattered as the realization hit me. I had been used, manipulated, turned into a monster, and now I would pay the price. As the police arrived and surrounded me, I couldn't stop crying. I thought about my family, my friends, and my life before this nightmare, and I knew, deep down, that I would never escape the darkness that had consumed me.
The first thing I noticed was the light. It was blinding, so bright that it pierced through my eyelids, searing into my brain like a white-hot needle. I groaned, lifting a hand to shield my face, but the light kept coming, relentless and oppressive. "Too damn bright, muttered, though the words felt foreign on my tongue, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. I tried to roll over, to escape the light, but something was wrong. My limbs wouldn't move the way I wanted them to. The space around me was tight, almost suffocating, as if I were wedged inside a narrow tube. Panic surged in my chest. I struggled, pushing against the walls of my cramped prison, but they pushed back with equal force, constricting me, holding me in place. The light was still there, still burning, and I couldn't escape it. I had to get out. I had to find some relief from the crushing pressure and the blinding light. With a grunt of effort, I shoved forward, my body contorting and twisting as I forced my way toward the source of the light. The walls around me seemed to resist, but I was determined, driven by a primal need to escape. Inch by agonizing inch, I pushed forward until finally, with one last, desperate heave, I burst free. The light enveloped me, harsh and unyielding. But it wasn't the worst thing I saw. No, the worst thing was what waited for me in that light. A spider. But not just any spider. It was enormous, its body looming over me like a grotesque alien monument. The creature's head was a hideous amalgamation of nightmare and reality. Two bulging, multifaceted eyes, each the size of my head, shimmered with an unnatural, oily sheen, reflecting the light in 1,000 disjointed fragments. Beneath those eyes, its mouth parts twitched and quivered, each mandible dripping with a thick, viscous fluid that smelled faintly of rot and decay. Its fangs, longer than my entire body, glistened with a wicked metallic gleam. I could see every detail of their serrated edges, designed to rend flesh from bone, to pierce and tear and destroy. The spider's body was covered in a patchwork of coarse, bristling hairs, each one like a needle that stood ready to impale anything that dared come too close. I stared up at the monstrosity in frozen horror, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to escape, to get as far away from this abomination as possible. But my legs wouldn't work, and wouldn't obey my commands. It was as if the sheer terror of what I was seeing had short-circuited my brain, leaving me paralyzed in the face of my own doom. Then the spider moved. It was a subtle movement, a slight shift of its massive legs as it leaned closer, those bulbous eyes narrowing as they locked onto me with a predatory focus. The air around me grew thick with the stench of decay, a cloying, nauseating scent that filled my lungs and made me gag. I had to get away. I had to run. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I spun around, desperate to dive back into the safety of the dark hole from which I'd emerged. But my escape was cut short as something cold and squirming pressed against me from behind. I turned and screamed, except the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a high-pitched, chittering noise, more like the shriek of an insect than anything I had ever made before. The source of my horror became apparent as I realized I was being pushed by hundreds, no, thousands, of smaller spiders. They swarmed over me, their tiny legs skittering across my skin, their eyes glinting with the same malevolent intelligence as the giant one behind me. I flailed, trying to brush them off, but my hands weren't hands anymore. I looked down in shock and saw that my arms had elongated into spindly, segmented limbs, covered in fine hairs that twitches involuntarily. My fingers had fused together, tapering into sharp, claw-like appendages. I staggered back, horror-stricken, and caught a glimpse of my reflection in a nearby puddle. The face that stared back at me wasn't mine. It was a spider's face, grotesque and alien, with 8 glittering eyes and a pair of mandibles that twitched and clicked in sync with my panic. I tried to scream again, but the sound that came out was a guttural, chittering rasp, more like the call of some unholy insect than a human cry. What was happening to me? How was this even possible? I backed away from the puddle, only to feel something brush against my back. I whipped around and found myself face to face with the enormous spider again. It loomed over me, its grotesque face twisted into what could almost be described as a cruel, mocking smile. I scrambled backward, but the smaller spiders pressed in around me, their tiny bodies creating a living, writhing wall that pushed me toward the giant spider. Desperation clawed at me, and I tried to fight, to push them away, but my new body refused to cooperate. It was like I had forgotten how to move, how to control my own limbs. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a strange alien instinct began to take hold. I could feel the spiders around me communicating, their thoughts and impulses merging into a single coherent force that pulsed in the back of my brain. They were telling me to stop resisting, to accept my new form, to embrace the life of a spider, And the horrifying part was, I understood them. I understood them in a way that was deeper than language, deeper than thought itself. It was as if my mind had been rewired, connected to a vast, inhuman network of thoughts and impulses that I couldn't shut out. It would have been easier to let go, to stop fighting and give in to the instincts that were now embedded in my mind. But I couldn't. The human part of me, the part that remembered who I was, what I was, clung to its identity with a stubborn, irrational determination. I didn't want to be a spider. I didn't want to live this nightmare. But there was no escape. The days that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. Time seemed to stretch and warp, days blending into nights and nights into days. My body grew, my instincts sharpening with every passing moment. I learned to hunt, to spin webs, to fight for survival in a world that was brutally indifferent to my suffering. Every moment was a struggle to stay alive, to avoid the countless dangers that lurked in every shadow, every crevice. Insects were no longer just insects. They were both prey and predators, threats that could end my life in an instant if I wasn't careful. The environment itself was a hostile, unforgiving landscape where every wrong move could mean death. Even the mere sight of a human could send waves of terror through my body, the memory of my past life taunting me as I scurried for cover, knowing that one wrong move would bring down the crushing weight of a boot or the lethal spray of a chemical that could dissolve me from the inside out. But the worst part was the loneliness. Despite the countless spiders that surrounded me, despite the constant communication and the sense of belonging that came with it, I was alone. I was a human mind trapped in a spider's body, doomed to live out the rest of my days in this grotesque parody of life. I did things, horrible, unspeakable things, to survive. I killed and ate my own kind when food was scarce. I wove webs that ensnared and suffocated anything that stumbled into them, their struggling forms feeding me when I was starving. I became a monster, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And all the while, that human part of me screamed in the back of my mind, begging for release, for death, for anything that would end this nightmare. Then came the day that everything changed. I was inside a house, scurrying across the floor in search of food when I heard it, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my body. The sound of footsteps. I froze, my many eyes scanning the room for the source of the noise, and then I saw it. A human, a giant compared to my tiny form, looming over me with a look of disgust and fear. The human raised a foot, and I knew what was coming. I tried to run, to escape, but I was too slow, too clumsy. The shoe came down, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in the darkness. The light was there again, the same blinding, searing light that had greeted me the first time. But this time, I didn't rush toward it. I didn't try to escape. I had learned my lesson. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing as I thought about what had happened, about the life I had lived as a spider. The fear, the pain, the horror of it all was still fresh in my mind, and the thought of going through it all again was unbearable. But what was the alternative? To sit here in the darkness, to never know what lay beyond, to never experience life again, no matter how horrific it might be. I hesitated, torn between the two choices. The light was there, beckoning me, promising another chance.